Thomas Mitchell stood in the doorway of his own home, briefcase in hand, having returned 3 days early from his business trip to Singapore. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of his Connecticut estate, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors he'd walked 1,000 times before. But what he saw froze him in place. A moment of reflection. His son, 8-year-old Daniel, was crying. Not the theatrical tears of a scraped knee, but the deep, frightened sobs of a child who didn't understand the adult world crashing around him. Standing protectively in front of the boy was Grace Williams, their housekeeper of 2 years, her hand gently resting on Daniel's shoulder. Her orange dress with its crisp white collar seemed to catch the light, making her appear almost luminous in her quiet dignity. And there was Jennifer, his fiancée of 6 months, her face flushed red, her finger pointed accusingly, her voice raised in a way Thomas had never heard before. A breath.
"He's lying,"
Jennifer was saying, her designer dress trembling with indignation. "That little brat broke my grandmother's vase, and now she's defending him." Grace's voice was calm, steady as a river stone. "Miss Jennifer, I saw what happened." Daniel was running to answer the phone, because he thought it might be his father calling. He didn't mean to bump the table. Thomas had built a technology empire over 25 years. He'd negotiated with corporate giants and navigated hostile takeovers. But nothing in his carefully constructed world had prepared him for this moment, for seeing his son's tear-streaked face, for hearing the tremor of fear in a child's silence. A gentle transition. You see, Thomas had been alone for 3 years since his wife Margaret passed. Cancer, they said, though the medical terms never quite captured the slow dimming of a light that had guided his life. Margaret had been his college sweetheart, his partner, his compass. And when she died, leaving him with a 6-year-old son who still asked when Mommy was coming home, Thomas had felt himself drifting. Jennifer had seemed like an answer. Sophisticated, charming, she'd moved in the same social circles. She'd said the right things about wanting to be a mother to Daniel. Thomas, in his grief and loneliness, had believed her, had wanted to believe her, a pause for understanding. But Grace Williams had seen what Thomas, in his distraction, had missed. She'd noticed how Jennifer's smile disappeared when Daniel entered the room, how her patience lasted only as long as Thomas was watching, how she spoke to the boy in sharp tones when she thought no one else could hear. Grace had grown up in a small town in Georgia, the daughter of a pastor and a schoolteacher. She'd learned early that kindness wasn't about grand gestures. It was about showing up, paying attention, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. At 42, after raising 3 children of her own, who were now grown and scattered across the country, she'd taken this position to fill the quiet hours of her empty nest. She hadn't expected to love this sad-eyed little boy with his father's serious expression and his mother's gentle heart. A moment of clarity. Thomas set down his briefcase slowly. "Jennifer," he said, and his voice carried the weight of a man who'd just seen clearly for the first time in months. "Please step away from my son." Jennifer spun around, and for a moment, her face transformed. Relief, joy, the mask of the devoted fiancé sliding back into place. "Thomas, thank God you're home. You won't believe what's been happening here. This woman has been undermining my authority with Daniel, and now—" "Grace," Thomas interrupted, his eyes still on his son, "would you please take Daniel to the kitchen and make him some of that hot chocolate he likes, the kind with the marshmallows?" Grace nodded, her hand never leaving Daniel's shoulder as she guided him away. The boy looked back once at his father, hope and fear mingling in his young eyes. A deep breath. When they were alone, Thomas walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Margaret had once grown roses. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long what?" Jennifer's voice had an edge now, the sweetness gone. "How long have you been treating my son this way when I'm not around?" A pause. The silence stretched between them like a bridge burning. Thomas had learned, in his years of business, that silence often revealed more than questions. People, when given enough quiet, would fill it with truth. "He's a spoiled little boy who needs discipline," Jennifer finally said, her true voice emerging cold, entitled. "Margaret babied him." "You baby him! Someone needs to prepare him for the real world." Thomas turned slowly. He's 8 years old. He lost his mother. He's not a business deal to be negotiated or a problem to be solved. He's a child who needs love, a gentle revelation. Love? Jennifer laughed, a brittle sound. Is that what you think this is about? I've been waiting 6 months for you to set a wedding date. 6 months of playing stepmother. To a child who looks at me like, I'm trying to replace his precious Margaret. I've given up invitations, opportunities, relationships. No one asked you to give up anything, Thomas said quietly. I asked you to love my son, or at least to be kind to him. A moment of truth. What happened next would be, in Thomas's memory, both swift and eternal. Jennifer's mask cracked completely. Words poured out, ugly, bitter words about sacrifice and expectations, about the life she'd envisioned as a billionaire's wife, about how a grieving child didn't fit into her plans. Thomas listened, and with each word he felt not anger but a strange, sad clarity. He'd been so desperate for Daniel to have a mother, for their family to be whole again, that he'd ignored every warning sign. He'd chosen convenience over truth, companionship over character. A transition. When Jennifer finally stopped, breathless and red-faced, Thomas spoke with the gentle firmness he'd learned from Margaret. I think you should pack your things. I'll have my driver take you wherever you'd like to go. The argument that followed was loud and dramatic, full of threats and accusations. But Thomas had already walked away, his feet carrying him to the kitchen, where he could hear Grace's soft voice and Daniel's hesitant laughter. A scene of warmth. They were at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of hot chocolate between them. Grace was telling Daniel a story about her own son at that age, how he'd once tried to bake a cake for her birthday and had used salt instead of sugar. Daniel's tears had dried, though his eyes were still red-rimmed. Both looked up when Thomas entered. Grace started to rise, but Thomas gestured for her to stay. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat down across from his son. Daniel, he said softly, I'm sorry. A pause for emotion. The boy looked at him, confused. For what, Dad? For not seeing. For not being here. For letting someone into our home who made you feel unsafe. Thomas felt his throat tighten. Your mother would have known. She always knew. Daniel was quiet for a moment, his small hands wrapped around the warm mug. Grace always knows too, he said simply. She's nice, Dad, even when I mess up. Thomas looked at Grace Williams then, really looked at her. He saw the wisdom in her eyes, the gentle strength that came from years of putting others first. He saw someone who'd chosen kindness when cruelty would have been easier, who'd risked her job to protect a child. A moment of grace. Thank you, he said, and those 2 words carried the weight of everything he couldn't quite express: gratitude, respect, recognition of a debt he could never fully repay. Grace smiled, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and made the room feel warmer. He's a good boy, Mr. Mitchell. He just needs to know he's loved. A gentle resolution. The weeks that followed were quieter, simpler. Jennifer left in a storm of fury, and the lawyers handled the rest. Thomas scaled back his travel, worked from home more often, and actually saw his son, really saw him, for the first time in years. Grace continued her work with the same steady grace, but the dynamic had shifted. She became not just an employee, but a member of their small, healing family. She taught Daniel to bake, told him stories about his mother that made him laugh instead of cry, and gave Thomas the space to remember how to be a father. A reflection. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Thomas would sit in the living room where it had all unfolded and think about that moment in the doorway, how a man could be so successful in business yet so blind in life, how grief could cloud judgment and loneliness could masquerade as love. But mostly, he thought about Grace, about the courage it took to speak truth to power, to protect a child at the risk of your own security, about the kind of character that chose kindness when no one was watching. A final thought. Daniel was 10 now, thriving in ways Thomas had once feared might never be possible. He still missed his mother. That never really went away. But he'd learned that love could take different forms. That family wasn't always about blood, but about who showed up, who stayed, who protected you when the world felt too big and frightening. And Thomas had learned something too, that the most important decisions in life weren't made in boardrooms or negotiated with lawyers. They were made in quiet moments, in acts of courage by ordinary people with extraordinary hearts. Grace Williams had taught him that, and he would be grateful for the rest of his days. A gentle ending. Because sometimes the people who change our lives aren't the ones we expect. Sometimes they arrive wearing an orange dress and a white apron, with calloused hands and a heart full of grace. Sometimes they're already there, waiting for us to finally open our eyes and see